Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Doerr from Bergen Chiropractic and Sports Rehabilitation Center. As always, with me is Dr. Doyle, my partner. And today we're lucky to have a very high-end coach in the track and field world, Coach Dave Lado from High Intensity Track. He's going to be joining us to discuss some pretty hot topics associated with track and field and some of the problems that we see develop within training programs, as well as some of the challenges that the athletes face both physically as well as mentally as seasons go on from here. So, Dave, welcome.
Thank you.
One of the topics I think I'd love to talk about, and I think is something that's really challenging to begin with, is track and field in particular is such a long season. Legitimately, even at the high school level, we're talking about kids really starting in November. And if they are more on the high end, they're going all the way through mid-June. Obviously, I'll let you talk about a little bit from even the higher levels of college and beyond as to what you're seeing. But how is it from a coaching perspective? Can you get your kids to understand, hey, look, I'm going through my season, I'm in my training, and I've got to hit my peak level somewhere towards the end of winter. But right after that, spring is starting. Like, there is literally at best a week break between those high-end people hitting their absolute peak, having to recover, and then re-hit a peak again towards the end of the season. What is it that you see? How do you go about getting your athletes both mentally and physically prepared to do something like that?
So obviously that's an important question to understand when you're talking about the levels of athlete. I train a lot of variety of athletes. The question can be answered in 2 or 3 parts. So you have like your kind of beginner athlete, how you structure that. I'll start there. So usually with someone like that, I do that I structure their training in like a progressive manner, right? And usually you want to peak at championship season, but if you're talking about like a high school athlete, their championship season isn't necessarily like the state championship or national thing like that. It could be their league championship. So that can be done, that could be a month before. So that's the first step, is knowing where you think that athlete is going to finish their season, right? So that's the first step of structuring peaking and knowing when you kind of rest. So the way I do it is I break everything down into to keep it simplistic, break it down into like 4 cycles, like 4-week cycles, kind of 3 building weeks, 1 down week, and then you establish that. And you work your way backwards. So you start at the championship of where you think you're going to go, and you work backwards from there, and then you can really establish a good training program. Obviously, like the elite athletes that are going to like the national championship, which for high school, which was just this past weekend. Yeah, even like collegiate athletes just finished this NCAAs this past weekend. So you kind of work backwards based on that model, and you can structure your peaking based on where you think they're going to end. Now, there are things that can change. If they're really progressing and doing well and really kind of hitting higher levels, then you do have to make adjustments along the way. That's usually kind of how you structure that and you develop it. So I always say, like, you break it into 4 weeks and then you make adjustments along the way. Based on where you think they're going to hit, that's how you kind of structure where they're going to peak, right? So someone that's starting in November, but they're a beginner, yeah, you might want to peak them a little bit more in February, something like that. But then some of my top athletes that are number 1 or 2 in the nation, right? They're going until late March, which is just this past weekend, right? They aren't, we'll structure them and we'll give them a base, but their base will begin a little earlier, but they're not starting anything. They're not really going into their kind of competition phase or championship phase until probably like end of January. Okay. Right? So you structure it like that. But I think on the high school level, that's where coaches kind of get lost. You see a really good, talented athlete. They want to run them race them all the time and things of that nature. And that's great. And then you start seeing them peaking so early. And I'll touch base on that a little bit. That's another thing, is like, it's a beginner athlete. You see them PRing 3 or 4 meets in a row. You shut them down. You got to stop for a second, because that's when you'll start seeing, they'll get to a point and then you'll get, I guess you can call it like diminishing returns, right? Well, then you'll start seeing a drop in their performance. and then that can turn into a mental drop, and they might start getting like body fatigue or whatever. They're not recovering enough. They're not doing a lot of like rehabilitation exercises, which is important. So then they're stressing their body, and then that's when like injuries occur and things like that. And you wonder why like kids have like the shin splints or the hamstring problems and things of that nature like later in the season, because their muscles are going through fatigue and they actually never stopped, and they're really just pushing through every time, and they're really firing their central nervous system at like 100% every time, because that's what's happening when you're PRing literally every race. So it's just kind of being aware of that piece. And now
I don't even mean to interrupt you, but I also imagine that has to be extremely challenging, because especially a sport like track and field, the varying levels of somebody's ability, where I'm trying to get this kid to peak in February, this one I'm trying to get in March, and it could literally be anywhere in between. Like the kid that's only making leagues, the kids that's going to be counties, the kid that's a states, the kids that's a regional or a national, that you have to structure all of those practices, even though all those kids might be there at the same time. You have to really create an absolute individualized program for each and every single one of them.
Yeah. And you can do that with one of the things I've learned with just my training business, high intensity track, is understanding how to do that in a more structured model. So it can be done a couple of ways, right? You can even, a lot of them can follow the same component, but maybe like the elite level athletes, their amount of reps might be a little lower in the beginning, right? Or a little bit more. You structure that based on how often they're doing, and when they're peaking and stuff like that, how fast they're going, when they're getting into blocks. We could talk about like the hurdlers, like when certain individuals are getting blocks and how often you're doing drills. So you can, I know it can get really tricky at times, and that's probably one of the hardest pieces of it, is to navigate that part. But to go build into like the next question is like, you just have to kind of read the athlete, right? To keep it really simple. You just have to see when, I like to structure in kind of thirds, especially in competition. If you see three peaks, like PR, it's time to do like a rest, a recovery type week, go back to some drills and stuff, let the body, let them recover, and then you go. If you do that, you tend to see a little bit more success with just the average athlete. With the elite athlete, it's a little bit simpler, right? In a sense. Obviously, elite athletes are a little easier because you know kind of where they're going to get to, and they just kind of follow the plan, and you just kind of go along that plan, and you know exactly when they're going to race, and you structure that because they're going to a meet and they're going to execute pretty well for the most part, and then you just keep building on that. Sometimes with an average athlete, they're inconsistent with their racing and their competition, so sometimes you have to give them an extra meet or something like that. So you just have to kind of really just pay attention to what's happening. That's the big thing. You do the practices, you can have like your structured plan, but you just have to pay attention to what's happening in the competition, how the athletes are responding. And I think that's one of the biggest issues of why you see a lot of injuries occur and stuff, especially at the high school level. You'll see kids that they'll start PRing like crazy really early. They start their season in November, they start PRing in December, everything like that, and then keep PRing all the way through January without a break. Now sometimes you can get lucky, but they have no break. They've never raced, and they never stop competing, and then you see like a really big dip. That's really just it. If you see like 3 or 4 PRs in a row, take a week, give them a week or two and structure it like that.
Talking about those 3 PRs in a row.
Yes.
If you literally, let's say, and again, we don't have to say which level of athlete they are, but if you literally see those 3 PRs in a row and you're saying, I want to back them off.
Yeah.
Even if there's a meet, now, do you still let them compete, or do you say, hey, look, man, this is your off week period. All we're doing is just recovery, active recovery stuff. Yeah. Or do you literally say, hey, it's an active recovery, you're going to compete, but we're not looking for a PR. We're looking about just competition style, getting in the habit of being, this is when your event's being called, you're going to race, like just getting into the rhythm of competition schedule. Like, how do you manage that one?
Yeah, and again, you can go either way. So let's say you pull back. That can be on a sense of training, right? So maybe the training can be pulled back. It can go 2 ways. You can either pull back on the training and stay with the competition, or flip-flop. Pull back on the competition and push on the training a little bit. You don't have to necessarily stop going to meets. You can just maybe do something different too, right? Maybe like that's a big one, right? So that's another way of not PRing. Let's say they're a hurdler. So we'll just use indoor times, a 55-meter hurdler or 60-meter hurdler, and they PR'd. Have them do a 200. Do a different event.
Okay.
If you do train them for the 4, maybe do a 4x4, something like you can change their event, right? The nice thing, I know sprinters might not like 400s, but it's a good event. But sometimes like a 400, you're not actually taxing the body as much as you think, because you're not 60 meters and stuff like that. When you're PRing, you're hitting 100% and you're taxing your central nervous system 100%, right? But in a 400, you don't necessarily do that, especially if that's not something you do all the time. Maybe your PR is for like a female, you're a 55-second 400 runner. You can go run a nice, comfortable 57, 58. You're only hitting about 80%. That's another way. You can still compete, but do a different event. And that can stop, as they say, like burning out, so to speak, right? You can see that, and then it can. So that's another way of doing it. So like what I do with my elite athletes, just to give a simpler example. I know they are going to do very, very well, and their focus is the 60-meter hurdles, or their focus is the triple jump or the long jump. The first 2 or 3 meets, they're doing something different. They might do, like my jumpers, they might run a 55-meter dash or a 60-meter dash. My hurdlers will do a 200. They'll do a 60. They won't do their specific event, right? And then they'll build until the time is right to like open them up in their event-specific events, their specific event that they like target, right? Like in the hurdles and things of that nature. So that's how I structure that, especially at the high school level, is because then they can try different things, Another big part is it's okay to go to a meet and do a one event. That's another one, all right? So that's another way of not doing it. Okay, you go to one meet, you do 3 events. Another meet, all right, we're gonna go, let's just do one, right? Let's, whatever that is, let's, or maybe 2. In the jumps, another good way of doing it, you don't have to take 6 jumps. You can take 2 jumps, right? You can do both jumps. You can do long and triple jump, but say, all right, the strategy is 2 long jumps today, no matter what. That's it. 2 triple jumps today, no matter what. You know what I mean? You can do shorter. There's a lot of variations that you can do to help not tax the body. And I'm talking about like an elite athlete, so that when they get to the end of the season, then their body's more fresh and everything like that, then you can ramp them up. They can do all 6 jumps at a full approach, or they're going through rounds and the hurdles and they do all of them, things like that, and they're feeling more fresh and ready to go. So it's not a matter of just like not competing, it's a matter of just not always doing 4 events. I do see that a lot. A lot of kids that come to me, they're like, oh, I ran 3 or 4 events today. I was like, their body's toast. And they do that every single weekend plus training. See how it can get away from you.
It's interesting that you're at. Look, I've known you since you were a freshman in high school, and I had the pleasure of actually coaching you.
Yeah,
you were one of the most talented freshmen that I'd ever had, like in my decade of coaching at that high school. It was interesting for me being, again, a high school athlete who was the workhorse. I was the workhorse for that team.
Yeah.
If I didn't have a meet one week, my coach found me a meet.
Yes.
Like, they burnt you out, and it's so true. By the time I got to my last event, or my last meets, which was usually, now we're going states groups, my worst times were showing up.
Yeah.
They were not my best times anymore. They were my worst times. And I think it falls right into what you're saying about of mixing thing up. And the way that you're even communicating, like if they're the hurdler, make them do the 200. If they're make them do the 400. Whereas that's almost on the same methodology of what we're saying is be a 3-sport athlete.
Yep.
Even though it's the same sport, it's a completely different event.
Yeah.
So they're using different muscles. It's a different type of even distance. So it's almost making them do a different sport altogether within the same sport, so that they're keeping their legs fresh for their actual ideal sport.
Yeah.
Now, you brought up something earlier too about whether they're walking into the season and the little nicks are showing up then, versus we're getting towards the end of the first peak season and the injuries are starting to show up at that point. Now, I know we go through that all the time. Like, we get to see the other half of it. We don't do a whole lot of the training, but we see, okay, it's at the end of the season and we have to deal with something. It's the beginning of the season, we have to deal with something. So I'm gonna shift over to you, Dr. Doyle, and say, what's your approach? Let's take something that's dramatic. It's something that all of us are scared of. None of us want to see a kid with shin splints. It's like the one injury we're always known in our office as, we're going to keep you in play unless you're going to kill yourself. how do you approach the difference of the injuries if it's at the beginning of the season, if we're starting to hit mid-season injuries, the nick-ups as we fatigued or something might have happened, versus we're in the heavy competition season and you're going like, I got to get this person to their event again within the realm of we're not going to create massive damage or permanent damage to the athlete. How do you approach that from the different signs you see the injuries show up?
So if I'm seeing an athlete in the beginning of the season show up with shin splints, I'm more so trying to give them those rehabilitative exercises to strengthen. At all times I'm going to give it to them, but more so in the beginning so that they can really build up their tolerance to the running. The biggest thing is training them with an approach of, you should be running to your tolerance right now. We're not trying to get you into the most important meet right now, so we're really building towards that. Whereas if I'm seeing an athlete at the end of the season, they're about to hit all their important meets, the goal is really just to get them through those rehabilitative exercises, taping, really trying to strengthen them and push them through as much as they can. But the problem is when we're hitting now, rolling into next season track, and they just push through any type of pain that they have, you never know what they're walking into next season with, and now you're dealing with even worse problems based on what they ran through in, let's say, winter track.
Yeah, and that's also from my standpoint, that's when I get worried about actually having to sit people, which I know from a coaching perspective, the worst thing you ever want to hear from the medical side is going like, this kid really shouldn't go. Yeah. Now, most coaches that I've noticed are actually pretty intuitive of that. Like, we need to shut you down. There's nothing that makes me feel worse, especially from the athlete. And I would say even more so from the college kid or the high school kids. I hate having to look at them in the eye and go like, you're done. Like, you need a couple of weeks off. How do you manage the mental aspect of it when you really do have to shut somebody down?
Oh, that's always a tough one. The one main thing I definitely do more often than not, I have a good resume of having a lot of athletes that have been with me for a long time. And you're talking about 8+ years, right? Starting with me as freshmen, and now they're finishing up college, or they've even done like a grad year, right? So I've had a lot of that, and that's usually everyone wants to keep running, everyone wants a PR, and that's a big thing. And that's obviously the goal of competition and whatever events, especially in the technical events, keep getting you better and better and better, and achieving new goals, whether it's a performance goal or getting to a certain meet. But when something like that happens, you have to. The thing with kids and even some parents and even some coaches, they're looking very short-sighted, or they're very short-sighted. You got to look at the big picture. That's like how I word it, right? With a lot of athletes is, some of them might have done something severe, pulled a hamstring or something of that nature, or severe shin splints where it's going from like a reaction to a fracture, right? Where now that you have to really start super shutting them down. But you got to tell them, look at the big picture, right? They might be a junior in high school. They're like, oh, I need this time, or I need this. Look at this big picture through the whole season. You keep doing this, two things. You're going to hurt yourself more. You're not going to hit the times. It's going to mess up with your mental state. And then we have to rebuild that. Rather than let's shut it down, let's take our time. Yeah, we miss a few months of it, but then you're feeling healthier, you're feeling much better. Actually, that just happened with one of my young men. His name is Graham. He pulled his hamstring last year for his junior year, and he's very good. Everything like that. We had a long discussion about what was the plan, and he just, instead of coming back in the summer and really building, we really took the time to have him do a lot of recovery exercises and things like that. And he came back to me end of the summer, right back in August, and he was itching to go, right? And we took a lot of time really building his running mechanics up again, really getting him understanding and confident with going 100% speed. Even getting out of block, he kept telling me, get out of block. I didn't let him to get out of block until close to end of November, which is kind of pretty late for the high school. Yeah. But even later, I think I let him, and I kept waiting and waiting. Point is, after that long regard, he probably had his best indoor track and field season this year, PRing like crazy at the right time, and he understood patience. And that's kind of how I say it. I shutting a kid down, you have to have that conversation first. So go back to the initial question. It's just really talking to the athlete, making them understand not just the short-sightedness of it, but the kind of long term, whether it's moving into senior year or what you're going to do collegiately or whatever like that, and seeing where we go. And then you build on that. You set a goal for that, and then you make adjustments accordingly, because injuries can be accelerated. They can take a little longer. Yeah. But if they are in the mindset of they don't need to rush through it, and they're taking their time and understanding what their body is doing, and that's a big piece of it. It's like, that's one of the things I try to teach my athletes. I don't just teach them how to do something better. I try to teach them how to understand their body, and their body will tell them when they're ready to go, so to speak. And I'm sure you guys do the same thing in many ways, and that's kind of how I structure that, and just really look at the big picture of it. Look what's not just a month from now, but like 6 months from now. That's usually how I make my planning anyway. I have like my 3-month plan, my 6-month, my year, and then my 3 years. I don't talk to athletes about 3 years, but that's something that does cross my mind. So that's kind of how I
know from your perspective, and I know Dr. Doyle and I use a very similar thing within the office when we talk about adaptive pain versus progressive pain.
Yeah.
And we see those, that could happen at any variation. Could happen at the beginning of the season, could happen mid-season, could happen towards the end of the season. If an athlete has never experienced pain, my statement usually is they're not an athlete. Yeah. Like, you just haven't trained hard enough if you've never felt pain.
Yeah.
So from that same perspective, I don't care if you have pain. Is it adaptive pain? Meaning, I'm going out, it's the beginning of the season. I'm starting to run. Holy cow, my soreness is an 8 out of 10 the next day. And the next time you do your training, it's not an 8, it's a 6. And now it's a 4, and now it's a 2. And now I don't get sore at all. That's adaptive. And that doesn't mean if you're coming back from an injury or it's just the beginning of training. Adaptive pain is good.
Yes.
That means you're healing or getting stronger. The problem is, and I would put this more from my perspective, the younger they are, the worse this gets, is being able to recognize progressive pain.
Yeah.
I have, my shin hurts. It's a 1 out of 10. Oh, it's a 2 out of 10 the next week. I'm at a 4 out of 10 a month in. By 6 weeks in, I'm going, oh, geez, I don't really want to practice at all. That's been an injury for a long time that they've been ignoring.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is they rarely have the maturity to recognize it, and they rarely have the ability, or they're afraid to go to a coach and say, I think I'm hurt. Because a lot of coaches don't react well to athletes being hurt.
Yeah.
And I've seen it at every level. But
I'm guilty of it also.
Well,
a little bit.
I think all coaches want the best out of their athletes and the best for them.
Yeah.
I think us as doctors, we feel the same way. We want to get them back on as fast as possible. So you're always trying to push the boundaries of what it is that the human body can actually accomplish and do. But it's also interesting to me, you get to your masters level athletes, which is a very big population for us in our office.
Yeah.
They need the least amount of coaching because they've done it for so many years, but they need the most amount of fine-tuning.
Yeah.
And I mean both coaching-wise, from what I've seen, as well as medically. Like, they know, hey, by the way, my toe isn't extending well enough on this side, my shoulder's bothering me on the other side. I mean, they are so intuitive as to what's going on with them. They are really interesting in how we even present ourselves towards how we treat them. Like, the master's levels athletes will just come to you and say, this and this and this need to get worked on because it's affecting this, this, and this. And unfortunately, you have to listen to them. And I know from our perspective, one of the challenges we have, it's also some of the more time-consuming injuries that we have. And I know you have somebody that we've both taken care of for very, very many years. But, I mean, again, barring names, how often do you notice in some of those master's level athletes that we might be sitting there for quite a long time fitting this Achilles, this calf, this hamstring, this hip over here, this shoulder on this side?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely come in with a lot of their certain dysfunctions. But I think the big thing is, let's say they overpronate on one side or they have SI joint dysfunction. Is that what took them, the last 20 years, 30 years of running? Is that what made them great? And then you correct it and they get a little worse. So you have to evaluate throughout time what each specific patient and athlete needs. Which exercises they need, what they need treated, what they need corrections on, and that really depends on the person.
And Dave, I want to actually go to you one more time with that and say, just kind of give, and again, briefly, what do you find from the high school, college? Because I know you've actually coached all these levels.
Yep.
All right. Tell me how you approach the high school athlete. And again, briefly, it doesn't have to be great detail.
Yep.
How you approach the high school versus the college versus an elite that might be doing like U.S. Track and Field Championship versus a master's level athlete that, for some strange reason, at 55 years of age, is still competing as hard as you could possibly imagine.
So with high school, a lot of it is, regardless if they're good, it is always still pretty developmental. So a lot more repetition and things of that nature, making them understand like the nuances of the different drills and things like that. And then it's progressively done based on the result, right? So you make adjustments based on how they do, right? So that's kind of how I structure the simplicity of it for my high school kids. I have my I have kind of like my structured training for them, and then I adapt accordingly to what happens, right? College, it's a little different. College, you would think, even though sometimes like when they're coming as a freshman, they're still very raw, but they, for the most part, especially if you're dealing with some higher level collegiate athletes, they still have a lot to work on, but it's more they should understand the event for the most part, things like that. So it's not, I'm not being as adaptable in a sense. I am in many ways, but there is more of a structured plan, right? When they're doing their pre-competition, when they're going into kind of their specific prep phase of the training or their specific cycle, as they go along. So they kind of follow more of a structured program of when they're doing certain things and when they're actually getting into their event-specific stuff. So that's how I do that. And then going forward into like with even higher level athletes, it's still the same thing. And then you structure their training, like I said, based on when they're peaking, when they're championship. And then I've had like, I don't do it as much anymore, but I've had master athletes. For them, it's more of just, like you said, they for the most part, they're not doing anything they haven't done before. So it's not just teaching them, they kind of have an idea how to do it. Sometimes their bodies don't move like they used to, which is fine. So it's really just adapting to their new stride length and ways of life and how they run and things like that. So you just make adjustments so that, they're going to run fast, but they're in a good position to, one, do well, and two, not hurt themselves. That's like a big one. Whether it's coming down the runway in the long jump, you gotta just, a lot of them say like, oh, I want this long of a run. You're not 30 years old anymore. You're not 20 years old anymore. You can't retain that kind of run that long. So you shorten it up, and then they hit top speed at different times. So that's what I usually, or I have done with like master athletes, because that's how I kind of structure that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, look, in kind of like closing and summarizing all of this up again, I feel like one of the things that whether it's an athlete looking for a coach, whether it's an athlete looking for care, or even recovery care, the bottom line is it seems to be such a universal thing that when you find, whether it's the coach or the doctor that constantly keeps trying to put the square peg into a round hole, it's probably not the right person. It's the coach or the doctor's therapists that are actually good at adapting to the individual based on where they are. What kind of aggression can I use? How do I back off? Those are actually the people you should be searching out, whether it be coach and or medical care. It's really looking for the people that understand how to adapt through either beginning, mid, end cycle, peaking twice, understanding that there's the multiple peak, understanding where they may peak based on developmental levels. But in the end, it still comes down to who are the people that you're going to surround yourself with that understand that there's an adaptability, whether it's on the coaching end or on the medical end.
Yeah. And to quickly touch base on that, because I know I didn't really go into depth of the peaking twice, right? You structure an indoor season to peak. If you do it right, then yes, then you can have a good recovery week or two. But again, that's structured. If you follow that program, you can do that for 6 months, and then the peaking will happen properly at the right times, and then you can always adjust. And then the simple way of doing that, that's why I said, if you see peaking happening too often, you just pull back a little bit, you make some changes in the training, you do that, you can do that or follow that kind of like structure for 6 to 8 months, and then usually an athlete can last that long. But if you're doing that, a big part of that is the recovery part, right? Getting the right treatment and things like that. I tell my athletes, I'm like, don't wait for the injury. Go get it treated even if it doesn't feel great. Like if you're feeling that over soreness, go get some treatment, whether it is maybe there's an alignment issue or something like that. So that's a big piece to kind of making sure you're peaking twice, is taking care of your body in that regard too.
Well, I think this is a hot topic that many people have questions about. I do think it's one of the most challenging aspects of sport is the length of the track season. But I appreciate all your time. Dr. Doyle and I at Bergen Chiropractic and Sports Rehabilitation Center. Dave, we appreciate your expertise. Again, if you're looking for an amazing coach, high intensity track, Coach Dave Lado. Thank you for your time and look forward to our next discussion.
You're welcome. Thank you.